Greetings, my dear friends, and welcome to another episode of Reading Epic Threads. I'm your host, Patrick Giles, joining you from Spring, Texas, this September 24th, 2024 at 10:16 a.m. Central Daylight Time. I present to you one piece today from the one and only Rootbitch, and this piece is entitled Camel Market. Before we begin, don't forget to detoxify with the 1-2 punch of the Epic Minerals Zeolite Extra Spray from epicminerals.net and the Epic Minerals Wellness Extra. The Wellness Extra has changed the game for me, guys. It is like it is a natural energy boost, the likes of which I've never seen before. I take it every morning. I take it every afternoon. It contains N-acetyl L-cysteine, aka NAC. It contains L-glutamine. It contains vitamin D, and it contains combination of humic and fulvic acids to make it all absorb beautifully. Guys, get this into your routine. epicminerals.net, promo code Shapiro for a 10% discount. And if your order is over $150, don't forget you get free shipping. epicminerals.net. Your health is more important than your money. All right, let's begin. This piece is entitled Camel Market from the Kuwait Times. The bubble that broke Kuwait. In the early 1980s, Kuwait's unofficial stock market, run out of a parking garage on the site of an old camel market, was the third largest in the world, second only to the US and Japan. But then, in an instant, it all came crashing down, plunging Kuwait into a brutal recession that would last for nearly a decade. How is it that a simple financial innovation could create such vast wealth and such devastating chaos? From clevelandfed.org, the Souk Almanac crash. In 1980, Kuwait was the financial center of the Arabian Gulf. At that time, other centers, such as Saudi Arabia with its broker-based stock market, and Bahrain, which was a satellite market of Kuwait's, were not the sophisticated trading centers that Kuwait was. Kuwait had more trading and more stocks on its markets than any other Gulf country. The banking sector was robust, with 10 large banks, and these were regulated by agencies using modern, for the time, prudential practices. Al-Yahya, 1993. Kuwait's stock market, the Bursa, had been established in 1977 on lessons learned from a steep stock price rise and fall in over-the-counter trading the previous 2 years. Regulation of the stock market was based on modern, by 1980s standards, principles of financial caution and good sense. However, side by side with the formal banking sector and stock exchange existed a less regulated market, the Souk Al-Manac, where new and innovative stocks, which were not traded on the Bursa, could be traded in an air-conditioned parking garage that had been built over the old camel trading market. Regulators had made a prudent effort to ensure that the banking sector was not too exposed to the risky financial innovation of the Souk Al-Manac exchange, for example, by prohibiting banks from lending for the purpose of buying stock on it. Both the Bursa and the Souk Al-Manac were not thinly traded. The amount of capital actively traded in these markets during this period of high oil prices was the third highest in the world, after the United States and Japan, exceeding even the capital traded on the London markets. Yet, in August 1982, the entire financial structure collapsed. The collapse was so severe that nearly every major participant in the financial sector took a hit, and so quick that most participants weren't sure if they were solvent or what they owned if they were. In September 1982, the Financial Authority ordered all debts incurred on trades in the Souk Al-Manac to be turned over to it so regulators could sort the debts out. In doing so, they determined the amount of worthless obligations totaled $93 billion in 1982 US dollars, an amount equivalent to $90,000 US for every Kuwaiti woman, man, or child. By comparison, the annual per capita American income at that time was about $14,000. The disarray of the collapse went on for many months, and some of the disputes that arose over the distribution of whatever could be recovered from the losses were still in process when Kuwait was invaded by Iraq 8 years later. In the end, all but one of Kuwait's banks were technically insolvent. The reputation of the Bursa was so ruined by the loss in value of its stocks that the government chose to resurrect the exchange in a brand new building and with a new name several years later, and the innovative Souk al-Manak was completely shut down. The entire Gulf region went into recession. The Souk al-Manak essentially started in 1978 as traders met informally to trade stocks that were not covered by the strict regulatory requirements of Kuwait's official stock market, the Bursa. By 1981, nearly 40 stocks of companies in non-Kuwaiti Gulf countries were trading on the souk. Authorities permitted the Souk al-Manak to form and operate with little regulation because they viewed it as a place where economic innovation could occur in a way that was separated from the rest of the financial sector. They hoped that the souk could find speculative and innovative projects that would attract investment from the entire Gulf region. Both the Bursa and the banking sector were heavily regulated following a Kuwaiti stock market crash in 1977, and the Ministry of Commerce and Industry recognized that the conservative nature of the regulation could stifle innovation. While the ministry allowed the Souk al-Manak to operate, it did introduce rules intended to prevent any interactions between the unregulated exchange and the regulated sectors. For example, banks were strictly forbidden from trading on the souk or from lending for the purpose of purchasing stocks on it, and issues on the Bursa were not to compete with the stocks issued on the souk. New issues on the formal exchange were heavily vetted, and the firms were required to provide public information about their revenue sources, business model, and capital structure. The unregulated souk was allowed to trade only stocks that capitalized offshore firms, not domestic firms. Neither the formal financial sector nor firms on the Bursa were permitted to borrow from or provide financing to the souk. In this way, the Kuwaitis hoped to reap the benefits of an innovative financial sector while insulating the conservative financial sectors from any risks introduced in the souk. By mid-1982, the souk had expanded so quickly that new trading technologies evolved to meet its liquidity and financing needs. Because the banking sector was specifically prohibited from providing credit for trades on the souk, a system was required to facilitate the exchange of future delivery of equity whose price was so rapidly rising. In response, traders evolved a method of post-dating checks. Many of the transactions were forward contracts. Throughout the summer of 1982, most traders were aware that all of Kuwait's financial markets were due for a correction. Oil prices had fallen in the spring of that year, and with the fall in oil, prices on the Bursa and the souk had fallen too. Shares on the souk were still viewed as overvalued. However, as its prices had risen more than 200% from 1980 to 1981, and by the time market trading ceased for the holidays following fasting at Ramadan, the general consensus was that the overvalued shares would fall in price to a more reasonable value. Both regulatory authorities and the traders were concerned about the value of the souk's post-dated checks. What was not generally known was how overexposed nearly all traders were to the risk of falling values on the post-dated checks, given that their collateral was shares whose value was declining. The trigger for the crash occurred after a few traders presented discounted post-dated checks to indebted traders for cash that could not be paid, and authorities announced that there would be no government support for the post-dated checks of the Souk al-Manak. The checks had been presented on August 20th, and authorities made the announcement on August 23rd. One trader recalls the way the crash unfolded, referring both to the Bursa and the souk. Quote, its decline was so discontinuous it cannot be called a crash. There were simply no bids. The swiftness of the market's disappearance is the most terrifying lesson of the Souk al-Manak. The instant crash took both the authorities and the market participants by surprise. Many had understood that the market was due for a correction, but they had been waiting for more information so that they could optimally unravel their positions, a strategy that proved useless. When the crash came, there was no new information and no time to react because, abruptly, there were no trades. In some ways, the Ministry of Commerce and Industry's response to the shock, as well as the response of other Kuwaiti financial regulatory authorities, was a model of a modern regulator's possible response. The response to the initial shakiness in the market prices in the souk was an announcement that the Kuwaiti government would not bail out the markets in order to prevent the extension of risks due to moral hazard incentives. The Friday before all souk trading ceased on August 23rd, all of the ministries in the cabinet issued a joint resolution amid statements that the markets were still strong and intact. The ministries also formed an offset committee to review the claims and settlements of the holders of the defaulted checks and determine the new balances. The goal of the response at this point was to calm the markets, while at the same time to set up a mechanism to ensure that both the Bursa and the souk had adequate liquidity to function. All outstanding post-dated checks had to be submitted to a newly formed committee by November 1st, 1982, for some kind of settlement, or they would be invalidated and not redeemable by the counterparty. Only in November, when the checks were submitted 10 weeks after the crash, were the authorities aware of the enormity of the disaster. It was clear that with unfunded debts totaling more than 5 times the GDP of Kuwait and more than the outstanding debt owed to the IMF by all countries in 1981, the crisis would not be solved by simple bailouts from the Kuwaiti government or international agencies. At this time, all dealers were placed under house arrest and not allowed to leave the country. This action was probably not so much punitive as it was an effort to keep all of the relevant information available. Further, in spite of the efforts of the Ministry of Commerce and Industry to isolate the Bursa and commercial banks from the innovative souk, the complexity of claims and counterclaims of the participants had heavily involved the banks in the crash. Banks were exposed indirectly to the risk of the souk by their borrowers' exposures. Many of the bank's most important borrowers had written checks for forward delivery in the souk, and as a result of the crash, these important bank customers were now unable to meet their loan payments to the bank until their assets and liabilities could be sorted out. In the end, only one bank in Kuwait's robust commercial banking system was solvent. The remaining banks all had to be bailed out. Collapses based on financial innovation recur throughout history. Innovation often occurs to finance rapid change, where, at least at the time, it is widely seen as having huge benefits in providing needed liquidity that outweigh the innovation's potential costs to financial stability. Most of the participants in the markets in Kuwait were neither con men nor stupid. They were aware that the post-dated checks they were using carried the potential for financial instability, and they were hoping that their makeshift liquidity system would be replaced by something more secure. What the Kuwaiti authorities did not anticipate was the instant collapse of both the non-regulated and regulated sectors and the severity of its consequences. We live in an exciting period of financial innovation when immense markets in new derivatives, new markets for collateral, and even new cryptocurrencies are invented with such a frequency that they often do not even make the front page of the financial news. It is clear that the potential for welfare gains from new technologies exists, and that regulating these technologies effectively requires a delicate balance of not stifling their development while protecting the economy from possible financial instabilities that might result from them. Since the article is from the Federal Reserve, of course, their main solution is more regulation and detailed data. Back to the article. From 1978 to 1981, Kuwait's 2 stock markets, one the conservatively regulated official market and the other the unregulated souk al-manak, exploded in size, growing to the point where the amount of capital actively traded exceeded that of every other country in the world except the United States and Japan. A year later, the system collapsed in an instant, causing huge, real losses to the economy and financial disruption lasting nearly a decade. This commentary examines the emergence of the souk. the simple financial innovation that evolved to solve its rapidly increasing need for liquidity and credit, and the Herculean efforts to solve the tangled problems resulting from the collapse. Two lessons of Kuwait's crisis are that it is difficult to separate the banking and unregulated financial sectors, and that regulators need detailed data on the transactions being conducted at all financial institutions to give them the understanding of the entire network they must have to maintain financial stability. If Kuwaiti officials had had transaction-by-transaction data on the trades being made in both the regulated and unregulated stock markets, then the Kuwaiti crisis and its aftermath might not have been so severe. Using the Kuwaiti experience as an example, I show how collapses can unfold with terrifying rapidity, with consequences that last for decades in modern economies with sophisticated financial structures. I argue that to manage and help prevent such catastrophes, financial data must be collected at a transaction-by-transaction level of detail from all financial institutions in both the traditional financial sector and the shadow sectors, that is, sectors that operate with little or no regulation, though they perform some of the functions of those that are regulated. Such data collection would have helped prevent the Kuwaiti crisis by exposing the enormity of the potential financial problems of the unregulated sector and its connection both to the banking sector and to the stock market. It would have also eased the nation's recovery from its stock market meltdown in that it would have facilitated the fair distribution of the remaining assets from the collapse so that growth could occur. The post-dated checks were like bills of exchange in that they could be passed on to a third party at a discount, but they differed in that a bill of exchange is intermediated by a bank. Because the souk was pushed out of the regulated sector, the post-dated checks were bilateral contracts written between just the two parties, and the collateral was only the future delivery of the stock. Because there was no intermediary bank, there was no institution for performing the usual bank functions of monitoring the value of the collateral and keeping track of those checks passing through its offices. The bilateral nature of the post-dated check also disposed of other intermediaries, such as an exchange or a clearinghouse, that could also have ensured that the exposures were netted, could have imposed early margin requirements, and could have tracked the explosive amount of risk within the market. Such a trading scenario is still complicated, and often futures exchanges use formal margin requirements to prevent large bankruptcy losses. Indeed, the souk evolved a system in which the post-dated check could be presented early at a discount to mitigate problems of forward default in a declining market. At a system level, however, the situation becomes enormously more complex. Although the post-dated checks could be countersigned and passed along to other traders, a practice that creates its own complications, often the post-dated checks were held by their original receiver, who issued a new check. The risk of the souk was at the level of a systemic network implied by all of the transactions, and not just a matter of large numbers of traders conducting dangerous trades. On this systemic level, the souk network was built from the many thousands of such interconnected transactions. Even if all the data of the transactions had been available to Kuwaiti authorities, they were not, it would have been very complex to calculate the creditworthiness of the system and how much liquidity had been created. A wide range of normal safety measures can be irrelevant if the collapse is far-reaching and sudden enough. For example, the presence of a simple margin requirement at the time of the souk almanac crash could not have prevented the crash, because the instantaneous lack of a market with which to cash out the short positions meant that the margin requirement would have been ineffective. Various branches of the Kuwaiti government, sometimes in collaboration with the Kuwaiti Chamber of Commerce and Industry, passed a series of strong laws and resolutions from September 20th, 1982 onward to deal with the crisis. Most of the laws, because they dealt with only one element of the crisis, were ineffective. In April 1983, the Corporation for the Settlement of Company Forward Share Transactions, the corporation, was formed to develop a comprehensive and acceptable distribution for the multitude of claims and counterclaims to assets throughout the economy. These included not only claims among the dealers in both the souk almanac and Bursa, but also in the commercial banking system and among many of the firms in the entire region. The corporation decided to use a mathematical linear programming solution that required detailed data from all of the traders. Principles were formalized of a fair final division that were implemented using a linear program. For example, the principle that the assets of a defaulting party had to be divided among the non-defaulting parties in a way that was proportional to their original state, and the principle that stakeholders' losses were limited to their original stake in the system became constraints in an optimization problem. It took the corporation and 3 financial engineers until August 1985 to solve the problem of what was considered a fair distribution of the assets. The majority of holders of the massive debt were not compensated until September, more than 3 years after the collapse. The financial tangle was still a mess even 7 years after the crisis. At the end of 1989, 1 year before the Iraqi invasion made the tangle irrelevant, all of Kuwait's banks but one were still under government supervisory control, and more than a quarter of the obligations of the crash still had not been resolved. For 8 years after the collapse, beneficial potential investments and trades were not conducted because the ownership of assets that might have been traded or used as collateral was not resolved. The Souk al-Manak crash emphasizes the value to regulating authorities of detailed information from all participants in both the traditional and innovative financial sectors. This financial crisis, like many other crises, derived its destructive power from the individual connections of dealers and investors. Detailed data would have helped both before and after the crash, and a lack of such data greatly magnified the damage. The crash also emphasizes the difficulty, if not impossibility, of isolating the unregulated financial sector from the regulated sector. The lack of regulation might foster innovation. However, innovation can proceed while providing detailed information to the authorities about how the new sector is connected to the conventional sector. Bilateral data would have alerted the authorities to the immense size of the souk exposure, and that the more traditional boursa and commercial banks were neither isolated from the souk, nor was the exposure trivial. It was a lack of data that also prevented the Kuwaiti authorities from seeing the risks of financial instability of the system. Immediately after the crisis, the authorities spent several months pursuing a policy that was ineffective, because they were unaware of the scale of the crisis or how pervasive it was throughout the financial system. After trying out several approaches to distributing the assets of the insolvent dealers and firms to those still solvent, which failed, regulators finally turned to traders' knowledge of most of the bilateral exposures in the economy. Data then had to be collected and entered into a format that could be used in the computation of an acceptable solution. Kuwait used policies in fighting the crisis that a modern Western authority does not have access to. Instead of placing all dealers under house arrest, as Kuwait did, resolving a crisis in a Western democracy must rely on rapid knowledge of which dealers and institutions are central to a solution and which data might be important in a complex reallocation that gets the financial structure back on its feet. Regulatory authorities in Kuwait were not bound by traditions in English common law that strictly regulate the provision of information, and yet even their settlement of the reallocation was incomplete 7 years later, delaying a return to normalcy in the financial structure. In a Western democracy, complete data of the history and structure of financial obligations could be housed in a regulatory authority to prevent collapse if the data held in the private sector are accidentally or intentionally destroyed. Good data can be required as a condition for doing business in an innovative financial domestic sector, so that in the event of market corrections or crises, delays resulting from data being extradited from foreign entities can be avoided. In maintaining this balance, the importance of good data is paramount. Regulators of financial stability in all of the Western democracies have made important strides in this. New information requirements in the United States make it unlikely that any future collapse in the CDS market would be met with the ignorance about the total size of net positions that financial regulators faced during the 2008 crisis. Financial authorities at both the European Central Bank and the Bank of England now have access to transaction-based records of loans and some derivatives executed by commercial banks. There are plans to expand that access to include more derivatives, more loans, and more institutions. Mexico collects daily records of loans from its entire financial sector. There is new awareness that data on individual transactions are needed for an understanding of the entire network. However, important markets such as Eurodollar loans remain somewhat opaque to authorities at a systemic level, which could mask stability risks. Kuwait's experience should teach us that information on all important financial markets is vital to the maintenance of financial stability before and after a financial collapse.
How do stocks trade? Grandma on the left has savings. The fellow on the right has stock. Grandma's going to buy the stock with her savings. The money in stock has to change hands. That's called settlement. In most countries, they change hands 2 or 3 days after the trade. That's called T+2 or T+3. And importantly, the money and stock change hands simultaneously. In the US, however, while we operate on a T+3 system, the mechanisms for exchanging money and stock have become divorced, so it's possible for money to settle whether or not the stock settles. In reality, grandmas aren't calling strangers making stock deals. We have stock brokers. Stock brokers work in places called broker dealers or BDs. Merrill Lynch, Goldman Sachs, Bear Stearns, E-Trade, they're all BDs. I'll represent them as blue circles. There are about 2,000 of them in this country, arranged in a hub and spoke system around a central organization called the Depository Trust and Clearing Corporation, also called the DTCC. The DTCC acts as a central back office for Wall Street, where 3 days after a trade, when it's time for money and stock to settle, it settles at the DTCC. How does it settle? Trades can be settled through the DTCC. In reality, however, settlement usually occurs within the DTCC. Grandma's talking to her broker, the fellow on the right talked to his. These brokerage houses have accounts at the DTCC, and when their customers are trading out at the spokes, what really happens is that the money and stock shift around within accounts at the DTCC. There's also something called X-clearing. That's when 2 broker-dealers settle directly with each other, external to the DTCC. 2.5 billion shares per day trade on the New York Stock Exchange and NASDAQ. These trades settle through the DTCC, within the DTCC, and back and forth directly among broker-dealers via X-clearing. Let's get back to our simplified system of grandma and a stock seller and see how the system handles delays. Suppose they do a trade when it's time to settle. Grandma's money settles through the system, but something comes up that blocks the fellow from settling his shares through the system. There could be all kinds of legitimate problems. He might be using paper stock and it's stuck in a bank vault, or it's at home lost in a closet or something. Maybe he signed the wrong piece of paper on some form. For one reason or another, he can't settle the trade, and you don't want the system to just grind to a halt. So the system creates an IOU. But note, it's not an IOU for money. It's an IOU for stock. It gets sent through the system. Grandma doesn't see that as anything other than normal stock. Her brokerage account says that she holds stock, not an IOU for stock. In most respects, the whole system just sees this as normal stock. It's only in the back offices that keep track of what's an IOU and what isn't. Assume that on day T+4, T+5, the blockage clears up, the fellow is able to send his stock through the system and he wipes out his IOU. Great. Imagine, however, that a guy shows up who wants to game the system, taking advantage of this loophole I just described. He's a villain or a miscreant. I paint his desk red to remind you he's a miscreant. Performs a trade with grandma. 3 days later, her money comes through the system. But he says, you know what? Something's blocking me from sending my share. So he creates an IOU and sends it through the system. Does it again and again and again. But imagine he doesn't really have a blockage keeping him from settling his shares. In fact, maybe he doesn't have any stock. What he's doing is gaming the settlement system so that he ends up with grandma's money, and all he's done is issue some stock IOUs to grandma. He's failed to deliver the stock that he sold. That's a strategic failure to deliver. It's strategic in the sense of deliberate. It's not an honest error. He just exploited a loophole. And in 2006, people are saying naked short selling, and they're saying fraudulent stock transfer. There's subtle differences, but the common denominator is that the IOUs are not sincere IOUs. They were strategically created. We're going to mark them as FTDs for failure to deliver and paint them as red just to make them easier to track. How does this look at our hub and spoke system? Notice the miscreant on the right has the red desk. I'm going to paint his BD red too to signify that the BD might be a crook like his client, or maybe the BD is the crook. Maybe the BD's honest, but it's a broker who turns a blind eye to his miscreant client because the client is, say, a big hedge fund that gives him millions of dollars a month in commission. So he starts trading with grandma. The FTDs flow through the DTCC and bounce around within the DTCC. If, say, for every 100 legitimate shares, there's one FTD, the system's going to keep on working. It's not going to grind to a halt. But if we ever reach the point where for every 100 legitimate shares, there's 50 or 100 or 200 of these FTDs, it'll become like sand in the bearings of the economic engine. Now look at the effect on a company. I'll show you basic supply and demand curves. Imagine there's a stock with a certain amount of demand out there, a certain amount of supply, and the point where they meet is $40. The miscreant shows up and starts gaming the system. He sends out FTDs. Since the system sees these FTDs as normal stock, he's increasing the supply of stock, of a parent stock. And when you increase supply, you shift the supply curve to the right. He does it again, generating FTDs, shifting the supply line to the right as he goes. Eventually, he shifts the supply line far to the right. Now notice where the supply and demand lines cross. Of course, the price collapses. The $40 stock turns into a penny stock. Most investors think penny stocks are the Wild West. They stay away, so demand dries up. As demand dries up, a ceiling forms over the stock. The FTDs in the upper right started off life as stock IOUs and sincere stock IOUs, but IOUs just the same. Now that it's a penny stock, these FTDs become penny IOUs. Penny stock, penny IOUs. The fellow at the right has the money. The firm's a penny stock. A vicious cycle ensues where the company collapses. Other businesses stay away from the firm. They say, gee, it's a penny stock. Is it going to be around? They stop doing business. Capital markets shun the firm. If you're a penny stock, you can't go into the world and raise capital. So as it loses customers and can't access the market, it can't recover. Society loses the products and technologies that were offered. And because the companies that come under these kinds of attacks are often software and small pharmaceutical companies and high-tech companies, because it's possible to create the most confusion about them. So when the next Microsoft or Genentech is destroyed, society loses those technologies. Shareholder value is wiped out. Jobs are destroyed, not just those today, but those that the company would have created over its life cycle had it not been strangled in its crib. And ironically, the miscreant keeps his cash and often does not even pay taxes for an arcane reason I won't go into here, but he generally gets away without paying taxes. Now consider a scarier question. What does the situation look like if there's not just shorting, but naked shorting? Remember our miscreant. Let's assume he generated millions of FTDs into the system. What does his squeeze look like? If shorting has gone on, that's not just the normal borrowing and shorting of stock, but naked shorting, been scattering these FTDs all over the system. And when the fellow goes to cover, there are more FTDs in the system than there is real stock to be bought. So as he tries to buy stock to deliver against his short, he gets in trouble. The supply and demand line shifts so far that they don't meet anymore. There is no market price. The market snaps. That's volatility. That's what the SEC wants to avoid. Why? Remember that a lot of this money isn't in the system anymore because as the price went down, the miscreant was able to withdraw his money out of his short position. So that money's been turned into mansions and Ferraris in the Hamptons and in Greenwich, Connecticut. And in any case, perhaps enough FTDs have been issued that the squeeze would take the price far beyond where the price was when the shorting occurred, so that it will take more money to cover than was taken out of the short position. If this fellow is forced to cover, he'll use all his money covering a fraction of the failures. But he's going to run out of money before he runs out of IOUs to cover, so he's gone. The broker-dealer could be in the same situation. In fact, if a buy-in really occurs, the price could get high enough that there'd be more FTDs in the system than liquidity in the system, in which case you would see a wave of failures move through the system like this. I know that sounds crazy. Systemic failures like that don't happen, right? Well, they did with the S&Ls 15 years ago, but this couldn't happen with Wall Street, right?
Indications that the London Vault silver red line is very close. What we call chaos is just patterns we haven't recognized. What we call random is just patterns we can't decipher. Chuck Palahniuk. Trying to decipher the opaque London gold and silver cash markets presents a formidable challenge, especially since understanding this market as the world's largest physical gold and silver market is terminal to the deception that it uses to fix the global prices of gold and silver. Multiples of the annual global mine production of both of these monetary metals are traded in the London immediate ownership cash market each day. Utilizing leverage to fix prices up or down never ends well, and thoughts of markets such as the Kuwait Souk al-Manak camel market stock fraud come to mind. At its peak in 1981, this Kuwaiti stock market, run out of a former parking garage, became the third largest stock market by capitalization in the world. The Kuwait camel market used a system of check kiting to drive Middle Eastern company stocks to the moon. Then, one day, an individual tried to cash one of the kited checks and discovered that there were no funds available. This led to further interesting discussions among other camel market investors who also tried to cash their checks with the same result. Camel market stocks then came back from the moon, and in a few days, suddenly, nobody showed up for the camel market opening bell. That was it. What the Kuwait camel market and the London gold and silver market share is non-existent assets, cash in the former, phantom gold and silver bars in the latter to set market prices. Nose under the tent of the London silver vaults, the most levered between gold and silver markets in London is the silver market. And the silver market has seen 6 years of global supply deficits of silver bars, and the 2024 global silver market deficit is projected at 265 million ounces. One would expect that with this level of silver to come out of vaults this year to meet global demand, that the vaults in London would be drawn down. But what we see when we look at London silver vault stocks is that London vault holdings have, counterintuitively, flatlined since 2022. The signal is that of the London silver float that is not claimed by ETFs, not all available to market. The London silver total float in August 2024 was 9,599 tons. This next raises the question of how big is the net vault silver float in London that is available to market. The London Bullion Market Association does not disclose this information. However, let's try to estimate the figure. We can see in figure 1 above that in January 2024, London vault holdings dropped to approximately 25,500 tons of silver. See the vertical red arrow. At the same time, in January 2024, the 2 months implied lease rate for silver surged to 3%, as shown by the red arrow in figure 2 below, signaling market shortage of the metal. Note also that implied silver lease rates have been elevated, signaling physical market supply stress since 2022. The implication is that the red line, the dotted red line in this case for available London silver holdings, is not far below 25,500 tons. The net London vault float may be as little as 1,000 tons, 32 million ounces, of silver, as shown by the dotted red line in figure 1 above, or less, in a $1.3 billion ounces annual global silver market and with standing cash market claims in London estimated at 5 billion ounces. The remainder of the London vault silver float, i.e. other than the net float, is assumed to be privately held and not available to market at current prices. While there are other vault stocks of silver globally, the inability of silver vault holdings to drop materially below current levels is of interest. While by design, we cannot know the net float of London vault silver, the signals from the vault stock and implied silver lease rates bear close scrutiny as we go forward. I will leave you with a clip from the film Lawrence of Arabia, where Auda Abu Tayi, played by Anthony Quinn, discovers there is no gold in Aqaba that he had been promised by Lawrence, Peter O'Toole, only paper.
Paper! Paper! There is no gold in Aqaba. No gold. No great box.
Did Auda come to Aqaba for gold?
For my pleasure, as you said. But gold is honorable. And Orange promised gold. Orange lied.
There may be very little actual silver, but infinite paper silver available in London. Don't forget to go to epicminerals.net. Use promo code Shapiro for 10% off. Spend more than $150. You get free shipping. Your health is important. Get the spray, get the cream, get the lotion, get the supplements. Let us pray. Saint Michael the Archangel, defend us in battle. Be our protection against the wickedness and snares of the devil. May God rebuke him, we humbly pray. And do thou, O Prince of the heavenly host, by the power of God, cast into hell Satan and all evil spirits who prowl about the world, seeking the ruin of souls. Amen. I love you all. Thank you so much for being here. I'll see you tomorrow.